The senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak on the budget resolution that I've introduced and on which we will have a vote, at least on a motion to proceed, later today. But I want to start with underscoring the magnitude of the challenge that we face. We have a full-blown crisis that awaits us. It could arrive at any moment, virtually, if we don't change the course we're on. The deficit that we have in 2012, $1.3 trillion, fourth consecutive year with a deficit of over $1 trillion. We are now routinely running deficits that are 7, 8, 9% of GDP. And of course, every year that you run a deficit, the excessive spending over the tax revenue has to be funded by more borrowing. And so we have the mounting debt that is now at really stunning levels. For much of the post-war era, after the big repayment of debt after World War II, the national debt fluctuated somewhere around 40% of our total economic output. Today, our actual debt held by the public is 73% of our total economic output, and that's just the publicly held debt. That does not include the liabilities within the government, which if you add that, it's up to 100% of our total economic output. Mr. President, this has never ended well for a country that has chosen to run up massive deficits and massive debt. And I would argue that we are seeing exactly how this typically plays out. We're seeing it across the Atlantic in Europe, where countries are a little further down this road than we are today, having run big structural deficits for longer than we have, and having accumulated more debt as a percentage of GDP than we have thus far. We see what's happening, especially in countries like Greece, where it's particularly acute. Other countries, especially on the periphery of Europe, that arguably are not terribly far behind. This is completely unsustainable. And what I think we're witnessing today on the Senate floor is that there's one party in this chamber that is addressing the problem. There's one party that is proposing very specific solutions. And it's perfectly reasonable to have objections and disagreement with any number of elements in my budget resolution, or Senator Paul's, or Senator Lee's, or the Ryan budget. But what I don't understand is how the majority party, the party that's actually in control of this chamber, can think that it's okay not to have an alternative, not to offer a vision, not to offer a solution to the biggest problem we face as a nation, and one that is imminent, one that, if left unaddressed, certainly will result in a crisis. It's just a question of when. I think this is an unacceptable abdication of responsibility. But that's where we are. I would argue that what got us into this problem is too much spending. If you look at the numbers, they speak volumes. Since 2000, federal spending has more than doubled. We took spending, which was as recently as 2007, only a little over 19% of our total economic output, grew that to 24% of our economic output. That's a tremendous surge, not just in the absolute dollars of spending, but in the relative size of spending relative to our economy. President Obama's budget is not a serious attempt to deal with this. It was put on the floor of the House of Representatives and got precisely 0 votes. It failed by 414 to 0, meaning not a single Democrat wanted to vote for the president's proposal. I can understand why. The president's proposal is to increase spending, increase taxes, and increase debt. The president's proposal claims to level off debt as a percentage of GDP for a brief time, but then it starts to grow again. And the reason is that the president absolutely refuses to offer a budget resolution that solves this problem is because he refuses to deal with the real underlying driver of this, which we all know are the big entitlement programs. The current structure of these programs is just unsustainable. And if anyone doubts it, look at what CBO has shown us and has told us. By 2021, just 9 years from now, if you take 3 categories of federal spending, the Social Security program, interest on our debt, and health care entitlements, those 3 things combined will consume almost 90% of all the revenue we can realistically hope to collect if the last several decades are any indication of what we're going to collect. How could it possibly be that we would continue down this path where those three categories are going to consume virtually the entire budget. I would also observe it's a simple matter of arithmetic that no significant federal government program can grow faster than the economy for very long, because everything has to be paid for by the economy. In fact, it has to be paid for by some fraction of the economy. And if you have a big program that's consistently growing much faster than the economy, well, it will consume everything. And then these programs will collapse. And then what are we going to do? Rather than waiting for that day to come, some of us are proposing specific solutions for this problem. Medicare is growing much faster than the economy. Medicaid is growing arguably at least 2 times as fast as the economy. Other mandatory health care programs, if President Obama gets his way, will grow even faster than that. This is all completely unsustainable, and we're going to fix this problem. The question is whether we fix it while we have this window of time when we're still able to borrow the massive sums that we're routinely borrowing, or will we wait until we have a full-blown crisis, the bond market shuts this down, and then we have sudden, draconian, and really very disruptive and painful decisions to make. I would rather do this while we have this moment. Change the course we're on and establish a sustainable fiscal path. So I've submitted a budget for the second consecutive year that puts us on a path to balance. My budget balances within the 10-year historical window of budget resolutions. It actually balances in the 8th year and runs a very modest budget surplus in the 9th year. I do that in part by reducing the total level of spending relative to GDP as compared to the alternative budgets, specifically the President's alternative or CBOs. I can't compare it to the Senate Democrat alternative budget because that doesn't exist. We have no idea what the Senate Democrat proposal is, but I've got one, and so I'll elaborate on that a little bit. My proposal is that we get spending down to about 18.3% of GDP. That is about the same level as revenue has historically been, and thereby brings our budget into balance. Now, some of my colleagues have suggested that there are draconian spending cuts that get us here. Well, let me be very specific about what spending cuts are necessary to achieve this. In 2013, spending in my budget is 2.9% below what it is in 2012, which means the federal government will spend, under my budget, it would spend 97.1% of everything it spent the previous year. People can decide whether that constitutes draconian cuts. Now, here's the amazing thing. After that, on average, over the 10-year window, my budget calls for federal spending to increase. And in fact, to increase at about a rate of 3% per year, nominally. See, this is my point. This is an eminently solvable problem. All we need to do is cut out some of the excess, restructure certain programs, and allow the government spending can grow. It just can't grow quite as rapidly as it's currently projected to do. And if we get that under control, we can put ourselves on a sustainable path. Another part of this is to have policies that maximize economic growth. I mean, that's an important goal in and of itself, but it's also the path to restoring balance because stronger growth generates more revenue for the Treasury. Well, my budget would do that without raising taxes. What I would do is have pro-growth tax reform that's comparable in spirit and in the direction it goes to all of the bipartisan commissions that have looked at this, whether it's Simpson-Bowles or Rivlin-Domenici or any of the others. I know there's broad bipartisan consensus on the principle that we'd have stronger economic growth if we simplified the code, broadened the base on which we apply taxes, and then apply those taxes but at lower marginal rates. That's what my budget calls for. It really shouldn't even be all that controversial to move in this direction of tax simplification, lowering marginal rates, and offsetting the lost revenue by reducing the value of deductions and loopholes and write-offs. That's what my budget asks for. There's a couple of areas that I think are important areas where there is bipartisan support for elements within my budget. One is the President of the United States suggested in his budget that very wealthy senior citizens contribute a little bit more for the Medicare benefits that they obtain. Some means testing already occurs within Medicare, but I happen to agree with the President that it's reasonable, especially under these circumstances, to ask the wealthiest members of our society to pay a little more for the benefits they're getting from the government. And so my budget adopts the President's proposal of expanding means testing, expanding the contribution we'd ask from the wealthiest Americans for their Medicare benefits. I also include in my budget a long-term reform for Medicare that makes Medicare viable. Now, this has been much maligned, despite the fact that one of our Democratic Senate colleagues, Senator Wyden, supports this approach as well. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that this is a different plan than what it was last year. You know, last year there was a criticism that any premium support model that establishes the amount of money given to seniors to purchase health care at a fixed dollar amount was a flawed approach, because what if health care costs rose more rapidly than that amount could afford to pay for? That's a valid concern. And so there's a different dynamic, a whole different mechanism in this proposal that's in the House-passed budget and in my budget. And I think it's part of the reason why a Democratic senator has embraced this, and Alice Rivlin, a former senior member of the Clinton administration, has proposed this. And because the idea is you'd have competition among competing insurers' plan, and you'd set the premium based on the second lowest bid for the health care services we want to provide, thereby ensuring that a senior citizen would have enough money to purchase that plan. Not only that, but we go further and we include the traditional fee-for-service Medicare system to which seniors are currently accustomed. We include that as one of the plans that could bid. So it's absolutely the case that any senior citizen that wanted to stay with the traditional fee-for-service Medicare program could do so under the reform plans. Now, I happen to believe that in an innovative marketplace, there are going to be more attractive options. And I happen to know that under this system, there are a lot of seniors, my parents included, who have to wait forever to see a doctor. And part of the problem is because of this dysfunctional system we have now. It's already costing us access and quality in health care. And so I think this reform will make Medicare a better program for the people who need it. And yeah, we'll ask the very wealthy to pay a little more for it. I think that's reasonable. And those seniors who want to stay in traditional Medicare, they could do that too. I think this makes all the sense in the world. And in the process, you can put it on a sustainable path. And it has some bipartisan support. But, Mr. President, we don't really know the extent of that, because our Democratic colleagues refuse to put a budget, refuse to mark up a budget in committee, present one on the Senate floor. And what I'm hoping, and I guess what I'll close with this request, and that is vote for the motion to proceed. Let's get on to my budget, for instance. And let's have a debate about this. And let's see where people are. I don't know how we're ever going to reach the compromise that we're going to need to reach to put us on a sustainable path if one party is consistently putting out ideas, a whole range of ideas, and the other party refuses. If we don't, how do you negotiate with somebody that doesn't have a position? How do you have that discussion? I don't know how many of my Democratic colleagues agree with the President of the United States and my own thought that we ought to ask wealthy seniors to pay a little more for their Medicare benefits. But if we actually got on a bill, we could debate that. We could have amendments about it. We could find out where the consensus is. And I just think that this is too big and too important an issue not to address. And so the way to address it is to vote yes on the motion to proceed, to get on a budget resolution, and then let's have that discussion. Let's let the American people see it. Let's take their ideas. Let's take all the ideas we've got, and let's see if we can make some progress. But there's an unambiguous fact that I want to underscore. There's one party that is showing up at this debate. 3 Republican senators who are proposing budget resolutions, comprehensive documents that address the entitlement reform we need, discretionary spending limits that we need, and the tax reform that will help grow this economy and generate the revenue that we need. We've done that. And it's, as I say, it's perfectly fair and understandable and legitimate to criticize any aspect of any of them. But it's, I think, an obligation, especially of the majority party, to offer its vision, its view, its alternative. So, Mr. President, I would urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this motion to proceed, allow us to get on with addressing the single most pressing problem facing our country today, restoring a fiscally viable path that allows us to have strong economic growth.